All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome in to our panel discussion here. Why don't you kind of introduce a little bit about what we'll be talking about,
I just wanted to say that was a fancy intro. It's the first
Al?
time I've gotten to see it. Like, wow, I feel very official now.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, welcome everyone. Tillery, I was working on writing a cloud course, and the number one thing you have to do before you start is what do people need to learn? And so I kind of started talking to friends and looking around things. And what I realized is we all know how, well, we all know there is a lot of information out there to tell us how to get started. Like, here's this intro course, memorize this vocabulary. All right, I've got my vocabulary memorized. I know where to click around on the AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, buttons to make things. But what do I do with them? And what I found is there are a lot of tutorials. Click here, move this, follow this screen. But at the end, I really wasn't sure what I did and how I could adapt that to the environment I was working with. So I thought, all right, this is what I need to teach my friends. This is what I need to get out there is I know the cloud, I know the concepts. Now what do I do with it before they throw me into a production environment?
Yeah, for sure. That's something I've seen a lot of as well, kind of that space between that intro where, you get a little bit of experience and maybe get your hands dirty and like actually being on the job for a year or more and really applying those things. There's a lot of kind of a gap in knowledge, both in blogs and generally in trainings there. And so a lot, that kind of led into a lot of the work that we're doing in the training space, but also, we might as well come and talk about it. So that's kind of the idea behind this webinar, this Q&A.
Birds of
I
a
guess,
feather, not a webinar. We're just here to
I,
talk.
yeah. I guess before we jump in too much, we should do some introductions for people who don't know us already. So Elle, why don't you introduce yourself?
Oh, okay, I get to go first. Hey,
Yeah.
I'm Marquez. I'm a trainer here at Neuvik. I've been working in the cloud since 2014, 2015. I was a Linux system administrator working on Fortune 500 companies, which is, I've got all kinds of fun stories to tell you about that one. I've worked in containers, been a community builder forever, so hopefully you've seen me around at a few conferences.
Great, thank you. I'll jump in next, I suppose. I'm Tillery. I'm the director of training at Neuvik, and my background is pretty varied, but actually very little direct cloud work. Most of my cloud work has been kind of in the offensive space, and that's really where I started my cyber background to begin with. I was a reverse engineer, vulnerability researcher, and then that kind of moved into AppSec in general. And that AppSec space is where I've looked at cloud the most. I haven't been kind of an active developer in that space or actively needed to use it as kind of my primary deployment environment, with the exception of kind of some DevSecOps things. And so as I was trying to learn and gear up, I hit these same issues that we're talking about where, the first little bit is really easy, and there's things that you can get either from the cloud vendors or from blogs, that sort of thing. But that next step was where I started to kind of fall off a little bit. So that's kind of why I think this conversation is really useful. Day to day, mostly I write and teach trainings and lean on that kind of offensive security background. So that's where I start to work on the cloud. But I've also found that a lot of the cloud content out there, especially the introductory stuff, doesn't talk about security very much. Talks a little bit about what it is, but then we get to either, and to now go read the well-architected framework from AWS, or now go figure it out. And that's really a problem when we're trying to deploy cloud securely.
I think one of the biggest issues I have, you know what? No, I'm going to just be really honest. I continue a learner. I'm always going to look to learn new things. And I'm still having this problem is I learned the cloud and I took all the cloud basic courses, AWS Cloud Practitioner, where I memorized what every single service that were and what it did, took the test, and then forgot what that technology was because I never used it. And then I was trained in ops. What do I actually do with the cloud? Well, not really, because you're a Linux system administrator and you don't touch the cloud, you're more operations side. By the way, there's this whole concept you're supposed to be doing on securing it. And I'm like, I don't even know the security principles. So let me teach you this. So it's 3 different foundations that you learn. And then they're like, okay, you know everything, cloud security. Like, what? Like, nobody ever formats them in a way that security isn't that afterthought. I have the cloud, now let's secure it. Like, that what I'm going to secure it as, I always go with APTs. They're my favorite things. Not that APTs are good. They're just my favorite thing to study, not my favorite things in general. But
Yeah.
I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna secure my cloud as attackers are pen testing it for me. Why didn't we start where I build it with security in mind so that they're actually hitting walls and not just do it, second day actions?
Yeah, the same line of thinking is something that I run into a lot in kind of the development and DevSecOps communities, and I'm sure you do as well with that kind of DevSecOps background you have. Very often, we build a design for something based on functional requirements or business requirements, ignoring what security requirements might exist, maybe not even having data classifications, and those same concepts that we see coming late and requiring all of that reiteration in traditional development, that goes for infrastructure too, and that goes for cloud infrastructure. But that kind of isn't present in a lot of this introductory stuff. So I guess that kind of talks a little bit about that security knowledge gap that we see in the cloud. So what do you wish had been covered in like a cloud fundamentals training for you? What would you have changed either in that first set of trainings or in what comes kind of directly after?
Right. I have a lot of friends that are trainers. All right. I have people that have courses out there, and this is no way to be negative towards their courses because I took a lot of them. What I wish I would have done from the very beginning is take a course with an actual instructor, not start online, because that's where a lot of people start. And I have nobody fact checking me. I think I understand what they said. I followed their tutorial, and I have a message board that I can go to and post questions and hope somebody understands what I mean. I think that was just difficult for me to learn in that way because it's all theory, it's all abstract. And so when I finally had the chance to go sit down, hi Brian, that's the guy that taught me first. Hopefully he's watching. And he said, "Okay, why don't you walk me through this build? Or do you know why you did that? Because that's what the video said to do. I remembered it, so I'm clicking the buttons as it goes. I had no ability to explain why I was taking the actions and what their intention was. And finally, when he looked at me, he goes, "Okay, what are you doing? Like right now, what are you doing when you're building your security into it?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm trying to keep an attacker out. Why? Because attackers being in is bad, but why?" And I didn't understand the principles of, hey, I'm trying to keep my clients' files confidential. I'm trying to keep them from bringing down the system. As I'm architecting the cloud, I'm trying to keep the customer from bringing down the system as they're overusing resources. So, the whole CIA principle, I didn't understand how that was melding into my day to day tasks. I know that was a lot, but yeah, I think it's kind of frustrating because there's so much. But the biggest thing I wish would have been there is kind of a story, something that explained at the line, at the end, other than you're trying to build a cloud that's secure. Hopefully
Yeah,
that answers it. I just went in a circle.
it does, yeah, and that's exactly the problem that I see with, for example, like web developers. Ryan and I are going to be giving a talk at a couple of web development conferences that are upcoming about that exact same kind of disconnect that we have. We have this like idea as security professionals, kind of because that's my background more than on the cloud side, that we have these principles of security. We have these definitions for what it is, and CIA triad is kind of the most accessible one for a lot of people. But just giving them even the CIA triad doesn't really tell them how does confidentiality really apply in their context. Yeah, they have data. It has to be stored somewhere. What does that mean? What is integrity? Is integrity resources, structures? Is it information? What does availability mean? And especially when we start to cross these divides between what is code and what is infrastructure and how do those things fit together, that kind of just basic definition of security starts to fall off. We need a way to describe that both to security professionals, that disconnect that's there in terms they understand, but just as importantly, talk to cloud professionals, talk to software developers, web developers about, yeah, there's the CIA triad thing, but here's what it actually means to you with concrete examples. I love your kind of example of telling a story to pull that thread along, and I think that's missing from especially those kind of step-by-step walkthroughs that you see. I mean, I'm biased as a trainer. I think that classroom training is a great way to learn a lot of these things, but those kind of pain points you're talking about kind of illustrate why that is. Um, so as you've kind of been having to,
I have a
yeah, go ahead.
perfect example for you that I struggled with. Like I said, a lot of mine started out with video-based training. And so I
Mhm.
knew a lot of the DDoS services that were available from different providers. I'm not going to go into who I worked for, but we also had a DDoS offering that a client had. And all of a sudden, I remember we had to authorize customers as they were calling in to make sure, and I answer the phone, and all I hear is, "We're under attack, we're under attack, we're under attack." Okay, who are you? How do you not know? Our system's going down. And so I look, finally get them authorized, look into it. I'm like, why isn't our service stopping them? Like, they pay for this. Why am I still seeing everything going down as quickly as possible? Okay, I helped build this infrastructure, but I helped build it with the fact that they had this kind of wall in front of them. And so we didn't set the right amount of redundancy in place. Whenever our whole data center basically started having issues and it started going down, we didn't build them in a different area because we relied so heavily on those services that the provider was going. Um, I stole this from somebody. I don't know who it was, so I can't give attribution to it, but it's not the cloud responsibility model, it's the cloud irresponsibility model. Because, yeah, at the end of the day, the provider says they provide us X. When we go out there and we get training, we are basically told, this is what this service does, the customer can rely on it. But at the end of the day, if I am the customer of the customer, I'm the client of the cloud provider's customer, I don't care who was responsible for what. I care that my life was affected, whether that be through me being unable to access resources as, let's say, a medical patient, or, hey, my data has been leaked again.
Yeah, that's a great kind of concrete example of some of the thinking that is lacking when we start to put in security as an afterthought. We have ideas kind of in a traditional web app, for example, of, oh, our web application firewall will solve that for us. We don't need to worry about writing our code in a way that protects us against that because we have this other thing. But something might cause that to not work correctly. It might be misconfigured, and suddenly all of that brunt falls on your code to handle instead. And if you're not kind of applying those concepts of defense in depth, then a failure at any point could be a failure for the entire system. And I think that that's one of the reasons that I proselytize threat modeling so heavily. And really, anytime you see me in a conversation like this, I'm going to bring up threat modeling because it's near and dear to my heart. But if you just kind of took a look at the what ifs, the hazardous operations analysis of what if this thing happens differently than we thought that it would, that brings to mind, okay, well, how can we defend against that in the next step? I think that's a really good example of one of those kind of, oh my God, what do I do moments? Or that, I was expected to know this, but I don't kind of a thing. What's your biggest kind of, oh my God, they expect me to know this, but I don't kind of moment that you have from your time in cloud?
No, we forgot to tell people if they're watching, like, you can share your stuff in chat too. Make sure to tell us your stories because God, I'm sure people have some fun ones. Um, like I said, I worked enterprise, Fortune 500, military environments. All right. Second day, I don't know how I ended up there. I could take an interview really well. Ask me what this is, regurgitation of terms. What would you do here? Tell you exactly what I learned in their training. And so they asked me just to run some simple updates. They're like, here, I quote, just follow the script, a monkey could do it. Okay, let me go through this. Well, I decided I was going to save time on this cluster. If you don't know what a cluster is, it's a bunch of different servers that are basically brought together to offer redundancy. So if one goes down, the other comes up or stays up. Yeah, nobody had taught me that. So I decided to save time by just doing the updates on all of them at one time. The entire cluster for I can say a huge bank went down. For I don't know, maybe a minute, the amount of phone calls that we got of everything going down, it was a cloud environment. So even though there was redundancy built in, we could have actually had a fail-safe put in place, especially since it was a planned maintenance. Accidents happen. And so afterwards, when the customer's yelling at me, I'm like, y'all expected me to know this? I knew the definition, but I'd never seen it in practice. So that definitely, I had a friend who accidentally deleted a database. It was a part of, because people label their databases as, AVT, whatever the long string of characters was. They just didn't read the characters correctly. They deleted the database. There wasn't the right redundancy in place because they thought they had everything put in place so that database couldn't be deleted. It's it's frustrating because we all have that moment and we all are almost embarrassed to admit that though we understood the concept of what we were doing and we could have told you about it, when we actually sat down and were behind the keyboard, I don't know if it all goes away, but you just kind of freeze up and you go through the actions that you were taught and you realize those actions don't match to the environment that you're in. Yeah, like, I'm still embarrassed about it, but at some point you just tell the story enough, you're used to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So back in my development days, I have kind of a similar situation where we needed to live patch a JavaScript thing that was being delivered to the browsers of all of our people, and it was part of the kind of ad tech tracking system that we were using. Well, we didn't have a continuous integration or continuous deployment kind of platform. So we couldn't just make a change in the code and easily push that out to people. So instead, we decided we were going to hotfix it on the web server. The trouble was on the web server, it was all minimized JavaScript. So we had to figure out the minimized JavaScript mapped back to the thing we could actually read. And of course, we did that wrong. We made a change that ended up just throwing a bunch of exceptions rather than working. And rolling back didn't help us because it was already broken in a different way. And so we're sitting here for hours with absolutely no telemetry, no tracking data, which really landed us in a huge kind of loss of capability and of our, then ability to bid on and deliver ads. It was a huge revenue drop because we decided to take kind of that short solution, or that short answer, which totally made sense to us at the time, and then we never did again. But that was kind of, along the same lines of we accidentally took the entire system down and lost a bunch of revenue because we didn't really know why it was a bad idea. And, this was more than a decade ago, back when I was a baby software dev. I know much better now, both as a security person and as a developer. But, my one of my first jobs out of college, I'm not going to know, much of that stuff.
So I'm gonna put you on the spot here. Hopefully you don't make anyone mad.
Sure.
We're talking a lot. So we have the whole concept of, I'm gonna throw it out there, buzzwords like, DevSecOps. We're all working together. Where is security gonna fit in? And you said that you know threat modeling really well and are passionate about it. One of the, I don't say engagements, but a situation that I was in where we're going through and we're trying to see, where their vulnerabilities really are. At what point is security dev's job, ops jobs, or sec? Because I have yet to be in an environment where all three of them are sitting together in a room working at it as it's being built out. And I'll hear devs, and not throwing devs under the bus, I love devs heavily, love you guys, say, well, that was security's job. Well, they got in because of the network. And I hear sec going, no, I'll throw the statistic out there. Gartner said that 90% of vulnerabilities are on the app level. And as a former ops person, I'm just sitting there going, I don't care whose fault it is. The attacker is, or the wolf is in the hen house. Where is that split? All we do is point fingers right now.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great problem that we have, right? Everybody kind of thinks that it's someone else's job, but we also have the idea that it should be taken care of for us, especially as developers. We just want to write code, right? The answer has changed a lot over the years. When I started software development, 15 years ago, the answer would have been, it's security's job, right? But that was before we had this concept of DevSecOps, the idea of kind of pushing left and putting that responsibility into the hands of more people. Ultimately, at the end of the day, like you said, from that dev perspective, it doesn't matter whose fault or whose job it was. If something goes wrong, it impacts your customers, and that matters. And so the flip side of that, the reflection is going to be, it's everyone's job to do security. If you have a failure along the lines, it's not one group that failed, it's everyone that failed. Part of that comes from the idea of defense in depth. We should have mitigations at the code level, we should have mitigations at the kind of software, hardware level, and we should have mitigations at the infrastructure or kind of cloud level. But even more than that, we really, to answer that question, need to understand, what are we doing? What are we building? If a piece of software itself has vulnerabilities in them, we can't rely on an externality like a WAF or like DDoS protection to necessarily save us from everything. We need to consider as developers, as early as we can, how can we mitigate potential problems? That's where things like threat modeling come in. That doesn't mean that it's just the developer's job, because the security team should have somebody as a part of that development process helping with threat modeling. They should be doing things like security architecture reviews. And there should also be infrastructure or security kind of governance that helps us to define what is acceptable from a security perspective that developers have to work towards. On the ops side, they're not blameless either. The things like redundancies, things like the ability to scale, those aren't necessarily solvable from a security perspective or a development perspective. That has to be kind of another set of defense that we have. that's a long way to say it's everybody's fault and everybody's job, right? But that's really what it comes down to. Wherever you touch the thing, wherever your responsibility exists, you have to support security just like you have to support the other aspects that we have. Um, we have a comment from Brad on LinkedIn, which I think is also a really good part of this conversation. Thanks, Brad. When he was doing DevSecOps or DevOps, there are security aspects that live there. And often, if you see those, you want to respond to those, but it's not directly in your purview, you might be seen as wasting your time or wasting the time of the business because, oh, that is security's job instead. And that is a great way to cause an us versus them kind of environment. That's not what we want from a security perspective or even just kind of a team perspective. And so your point, Brad, there that security needs to be built in from the beginning is exactly right. That's why we need to do things like application threat modeling, but also network and infrastructure threat modeling, understand what our threat looks like, and crucially, what is acceptable in those environments. And often that's going to be enterprise risk level. It's going to be kind of management dictating that down. That's also okay. That also helps us to answer that question that Elle brought up of, who's responsible at this particular point. And that's always been the case, and it was the case in traditional kind of, mainframe or a single deployment perspective. But as we shift to the cloud, it's more and more true. And I think that shows a attitude or a culture shift that really needs to happen in these organizations, because I've seen that just like you have, Brad, and I think that it's a problem. It's a problem we need to try and fix through discussions and through trainings and through, kind of working from the bottom up and from the top down. As a trainer, as an educator, I really enjoy working with dev teams because I feel like I have the most impact there. But no matter what I teach a dev team, if they don't have the support from management to do those things, it's ultimately fruitless. Which is why, when we're consulting at an organization, often I'll pull in, our enterprise risk folks and have them talk kind of top down as well. If someone's not willing to make that change, then they're not going to have a secure organization.
So let me muddy the waters for you then.
Yeah.
Right. So obviously in writing training, I want to be as inclusive as I can to all kinds of different careers, jobs. And so I could have a cloud architect in there, right, who's responsible for developing it all out, cloud deployments team, who's responsible for building it, getting all the resources. I've got devs who are responsible for their code, but at times responsible for actually creating the resources that their code's going to run on, deciding where things are going to be stored. And I have ops who's in charge of trying to figure out, I feel bad for ops, I used to be it. So I'm sorry if I always present in this way, but basically is trying to hope the documentation is there to figure out how everything is built. And so I was lucky enough to be invited to be in an SRE panel, site reliability engineering panel, as the security person. And they just kept talking about day one operations and how everything got there. And I listened to their whole, spiel about how everything was built. And I said, well, you're a DevOps shop, right? Or DevSecOps shop, right? I haven't heard you mention security once in this. Like, oh, well, we've got to get our environment up by X deadline. So once we've got it up, we pass it over to the security team. We start working together to get it done. So security is a day two operation. What happens through this process? Well, I tried to bring it up, but they said that's going to prolong. We've got to get this up by the deadline that the customer made. And so it's almost like they're selling security to the customer as an add-on, like, oh, you have your environment, but we can also offer you this security option. So I just kept pushing back, and one of them, I can't believe they did it, but they finally looked at me and they said, how much do we stand to lose if we don't make the deadline for the customer versus how realistic is a breach to happen and how much would we lose if it were? It's a cost benefit analysis there, and that absolutely terrified me. And through the entire piece, from architect down to the developer, no one could tell me where the security split there. It's almost like being in the cloud muddies it even more.
Yeah, no, that's a problem. It's a real problem, and we see that traditional development, but even more so in the cloud where things do kind of get fragmented. When I talk to development teams, I'm going to bring it back to that kind of concept again. That bottom up and top down problem that we have where we have to meet somewhere, that includes the amount of time security takes, because it does take a non-zero amount of time to do that. The easiest way to sell it that I found is to say, finding these things now saves you time in the future. And that is true, but it doesn't, as you're kind of saying, necessarily help with that, that day one deployment, right? Getting it up initially. we need to start taking those things into account with our timelines. And that's a hard sell for a consultant. That's a hard sell for a company where they have to bid on something and they have to win that bid. If one person is taking into account security and another one isn't, if you can't make the case for that, you lose that project. So people need to get better at making that case. And that's something that we work pretty heavily on in the reporting that we do from our advanced assessments team, for example. I work really hard, and the team has worked really hard to kind of make sure that when we have, for example, a executive summary, we're not just giving the list of vulnerabilities or the groupings that they have. We talk about the actual impact to the business. We talk about, this family of things, regardless of their criticality, have this root cause or this impact, and here's why it matters from a business perspective. And being able to talk to that, it's really hard for engineers to do. It's really hard for anyone to do that doesn't have an MBA, right? But that's what's really going to make that impact to the client you're bidding towards or whatever. And that's hard. That's going to be hard from a cloud perspective. That's going to be hard from a dev perspective. But especially when we start talking about, we need reliability, we need uptime, we have all of these promises and SLAs that we're making in the cloud world that, muddy that even more. So the ideal world, we start everything fundamentally secure from the ground up. We build that into our time estimates, and that solves the problem for us. Unfortunately, we live in a world where people are going to bid low and try and win it. And that is a fact of it. So then have the conversation with your clients. That's what we try to do.
All right. So I know that they just gave us the 2-minute mark. I know we talked about a lot, and people might be wondering, wait, how am I supposed to take everything they just talked about and figure out where my journey is supposed to be? So I'm going to do my end advice and how I brought it all together. If you want to set yourself apart from everybody else that's tackling the cloud right now, and hey, help you further your career, help you get the next job, be the person that understands, hey, this is how cloud deployments happen. We have our architect. I have an idea of where it is that I want to fit it in. As I'm going through it, what part does security play? Hey, I'm architecting my cloud. Where would a vulnerability be introduced? If I have a software issue, how is my architecture and my availability going to be able to respond to it? Worry less right now in your second step about actually creating your resources, about actually deploying your VPCs, and be able to sit down and on a piece of paper, write it all out and put in where security is. Once you're able to do that, you'll have your next step on actually building what you drew out.
Yeah, I think that really illustrates the way that it seems to work today is that we're taught how to create cloud resources, we're taught how to administer cloud resources, and we're taught how to secure cloud resources, as if those are three separate disciplines. But at the end of the day, people are doing all three of those things at once. And if we don't really pack all of those things together and understand how they fit together, we're doing a disservice to ourselves and to the people who then are going to use our cloud or use our infrastructure. And that's really a huge part of the disconnect or the gap that we saw, and part of why we're having this conversation, and part of why we wrote the cloud training the way that we did, is that we need to connect what IAM is, what resource management is, how the permissions, both on the developer side for insider threat considerations and the user side for deployment and all of that, fit in to make a thing that works and works securely kind of a fundamental thought. And it's hard. It is. It's a lot to try to learn at once. But if you try to tackle that in a unified way rather than a disconnected way, you come out of it understanding how it all fits together instead of not really understanding it at all.
I'm going to throw one last thing. Like I said, you don't have to go at it alone. I hate starting at online training. Love online training because of its accessibility. But if you are at that point, like Neuvik, right? We're not a service company. I'm not here to charge you for it. Reach out to either of us on Twitter. We'd be happy to continue this conversation. Just help you learn. That's really what we're all about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to echo that, right? Yeah, we have trainings on this stuff. Both on the cloud things and a lot of threat modeling. We have those coming up in the next quarter, but that doesn't mean that that's the only way to learn. You can absolutely just reach out to the community and kind of engage with them. And that's how I learned a lot of my cloud knowledge is through talking with people like Elle, people, who are going to be doing this stuff day to day and learning it that way. And that's also super effective.
I think we went over on time, so we better say goodbye to our friends.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thanks for the questions you sent in. If we didn't get to your question, ping us again, or we'll reach out kind of one-on-one, and we'll answer them individually. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.